Welcome to the Brute Strength Podcast, bringing you worldwide experts from all areas of health and fitness. We cover training, nutrition, coaching, and mindset. Welcome your host, strength and conditioning coach, 2012 and 2013 CrossFit Games champ, Michael Cazue. Mind, body, brute.
Hey, and welcome back. My name is Mike Cazue, and you're listening to the Brute Strength Podcast. This is episode 2 of 6 in the What is Brute podcast series. In episode 1, I broke down the basic philosophy of how we started Brute in the first place. To sum it up, if you didn't listen to the first one, basically, we wanted to create a team of experts that would collaborate with one another to produce the highest quality programming, the most effective programming for athletes in the sport of fitness. So rather than one person being the expert in gymnastics, weightlifting, endurance, etc., we wanted a team to collaborate, each in his or her own expertise, to produce something more effective than anything else out there. So that's episode 1. This is episode 2. Today, I bring you Nick Fowler. Nick is our guru. He's our director of strength and conditioning. And in this show, he breaks down the basis of his programming philosophy, and he explains how he orchestrates the programming of all of these different experts. We talk about training in the off season, which we just started, and the unique things about the Brute one-on-one coaching, the completely individualized training that we offer that sets it apart, that don't exist really anywhere else. So before we get started, if you're interested in learning more about our programs and especially the one-on-one programs, you can go to brutestrengthtraining.com/programs. Go to any of our competitor programs and check out what we offer. Again, that's brutestrengthtraining.com/programs. Enjoy the show. Nick, what's up, man? Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Mike. Pretty excited, as always.
Let's jump into it. So we always say that we train the mind first. In your opinion, what's the most important mental skill or mindset that an athlete can develop?
Yeah, I think a couple things come to mind for me. One is the process, and I see that as the biggest barrier to mindset development in general, right? So the friction that occurs with the process, right? And that's usually set up with goals in the future and this sense of like being in a rush to get there, and understanding that the process is uncomfortable. And I think that is a key component to developing or starting to develop a healthy mindset around being an athlete development, training, things like that. The other thing that comes to mind, I think, is the type of motivation, right? There's typically a couple different types of motivation. There's external and internal or intrinsic motivation that can define our why. And what I've found is trying to shift with athletes, trying to shift the mindset or the motivation away from external into more of an intrinsic motivation, tends to, just develop a little bit more mental toughness, resiliency, just a kind of a champion's mindset. And I think that that's honestly one of the biggest, if you could narrow it down, that's probably as narrow as I can see it, right? So now how we do that, and the process to get there is complex, but I think if we can be motivated internally, right, and intrinsically, we're a lot better off. And I think it comes down to understanding our why, right? If our why exists out there in the world with a friend, a coach, a loved one, a gym, a community, when that external expectation doesn't exist, whether it's, that one time that you're having to train alone, whether, you're going to that, that deep, dark, happy place in a workout where you're kind of having to suffer, maybe you're traveling. There's all these circumstances that take us away from those external motivators. So if we can essentially take that, internalize it, then we carry that wherever we go. And I think that in terms of developing a champion's mindset, that's pretty key.
Yeah, I love both of those. Those are both huge pieces of mindset. In terms of purpose, it takes people doing some really deep thinking to get really clear about what their purpose is first, right? And then to really internalize that and be aware of that when they're in these challenging moments. And when it comes to the process, I think one of the most common mistakes I see people in all disciplines making is a sole focus on the outcome, right? They want to make it to regionals, or they want to get a 250-pound snatch, or they want to win a championship or get this new job, instead of focusing on the steps that it takes to get there, the steps that it takes to become the type of person that gets that kind of job, or become the type of player that is capable of winning a championship. So that's an enormous little shift of mindset that can immediately transform an athlete.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the biggest thing that you talk about there is the skill, right? It's a skill that needs to be constantly developed and honed. And just like any skill, if you don't use it, if you're not working on it, it goes away. It gets rough, right? It gets harder to practice the mindset.
Mm-hmm. So you are the sensei of Brute. You're the Yoda, right? You wrangle all of these experts that we have together and synthesize the programming in a way that is achievable and maximally effective for all of our athletes. How do you set up the general skeleton for the programs, and kind of take us through the process of synthesizing what these experts are giving you?
Yeah, it's been a learning curve for me. Having, Chris Hinshaw, Adrian Conway, Sean Pastuche, Sorrell, yourself, Matt Bruce, all these amazing experts, coaching amazing athletes, and trying to get on the same page essentially was, is really the first thing that comes to mind. And it's actually, honestly, pretty easy. And I think the biggest key is that we all come from a place of being a perpetual student and wanting to learn and wanting to understand, and really understanding that there are a lot of complexities that I may not fully grasp, or Nick Sorrell or Adrian. And so this idea of coming together as a team is just, I think, naturally occurred. It's kind of, I mean, you're a part of it. It's pretty amazing when we all get together. There's, we're all on the same wavelength, right? We're all thinking about solutions and kind of this willingness to learn. I think when I think about, setting up the skeleton, it obviously starts with conversations around where we are in the season. So I take a seasonal approach to setting up the training year, right? The off season should look different than in season, meaning when the open comes around, or if you're getting ready for a competition. And so that's kind of where I start with the foundation. The year-long skeleton is in a seasonal format. And so having these conversations with, Hinshaw and Pastuche and these coaches that are just so incredibly good at what they do, and really laying out this idea of characteristics, right? So I think about, instead of training a specific movement or a specific skill, I look at improving characteristics. And so a lot of the conversations that we end up having are around characteristics, right? So, muscle endurance or aerobic base, the ability to breathe. And so it doesn't matter if it's in a, air squat, front squat, thruster, or wall ball. The characteristic that we're looking to improve can be the same or similar along those four movements. And so I think,
how is this either the same or distinct from quote unquote energy system training?
Yeah, well, we can go down a deep rabbit hole with that for sure. So energy system training, I think, is getting into the weeds, right? So I think when we talk about the skeleton and the overview and the seasonal approach is kind of broad characteristics. So in the off season, I I want to focus on building the base, right? Those foundational pieces that are going to hold up everything that we are going to pile on top of that throughout the year. So it could be aerobic base. And so when we think about energy systems, it's building an aerobic base. And you can think about zone one work. You can think about just easy aerobic breathing work. Getting on a rower for 20 minutes in your warm up is a fantastic, easy way to do it. That is energy system training. And you could say in its simplest form, but
everything is energy system training, right?
In a way, yeah. And so I think, setting up a seasonal base approach kind of helps, I think, all of us have that same conversation saying, okay, what needs to occur in this time of year? And then, for instance, with Hinshaw, right, like talking about like, okay, we're 9 months out from having to compete. And so what are the priorities right now to make us successful later, right? Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of the things that I look at and the conversations that I have are around first is protecting joints and energy systems. So what I mean by that is when I set up the skeleton, I focus it on two things. One is making sure that movements don't create over patterning in joints. Right. So a good example is I lay out the week and I'm not going to have somebody squat 5 days in a row, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Right. There might be a heavy squat followed by maybe a light squat the next day, but making sure that we protect joints long term is really important. So that's like, I think that, and then energy systems and protecting the energy systems is the foundation of how I start laying out the skeleton, if you will. And what I mean by energy systems is it can be as simple as, if you're going to go hard on Monday, then change it up and don't go hard on Tuesday. Right. And so we could get into, the details and talk about, how you should train power before, aerobic work or before lactate work. And so we can get into the details of, the specifics of energy systems. But if you keep it very simple, you just want to protect the ability to adapt from that stress. Mm-hmm. So on Monday, if you go really, really hard and you're doing sprint work, you need time for your body to adapt to that. And you need to rest that specific energy system, if that makes sense. So on Tuesday, if you go back and you do sprint work, your body potentially won't have the time to recover. So ideally, on that Tuesday, the day following, you do something else. It doesn't mean you don't breathe, you don't sit on the couch, things like that, but maybe it's just aerobic breathing or threshold work or something else. Right. And so I think those two things.
Very basic exercise science right there.
Completely. Yeah. And we can get into the weeds for sure. But honestly, like that, getting down to the basics, like setting up the skeleton and having conversations and making sure everybody's input kind of fits that skeleton to begin with is most important for sure.
I love the characteristics approach. It makes me think about, and this kind of speaks to the, you said we're all on the same wavelength. It makes me think of Nick Sorrell's metaphor of the birdhouse and the carpenter, right? So you're talking about, so what most people do is at the end of the season, they help their athlete identify, say, 5 movements that they really need to improve on. And then the programming is built to maintain everything, but then make those movements better, right? But instead, your approach is building upon characteristics so that if someone's front squat needs to go up, you don't just give them front squatting, you give them a power and strength program to work on that characteristic. And Nick's example is Nick Sorrell, we could teach you how to build a birdhouse. We could give you the exact blueprint so that anytime you wanted, you can go out and execute the perfect birdhouse. Or we could teach you how to be a carpenter so that you have the skills to build anything that you want. So by training characteristics, it builds a much, much more well-rounded athlete. It promotes injury prevention, and it makes it so that no matter what the sport throws at these athletes, they're prepared.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is the sport is constantly varied.
Mm-hmm.
The open, we weren't sure what was going to come out. The regionals, I mean, last year there wasn't a barbell.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can train the characteristics, it doesn't matter if it's a barbell or a kettlebell. I mean, it matters a little bit, but there's no way to predict for it, right?
Right.
So
I love how Dave Castro made this huge deal about like there's this new movement coming out, and it was a fucking dumbbell squat.
Oh, the clean, right?
Yeah. So funny.
Yeah. Yeah. And the handstand walk, which I thought the open was great this past year. I really enjoyed it. So, yeah.
So you've got a half dozen coaches contributing to the programs and the development of all of our athletes, each of who has his own expertise and input on everything. So with that said, there's only so much time in the day that these athletes have to train. How have you figured out what to keep in and what to take out?
Yeah, honestly, I think the approach that I go through it answers itself. And what I mean by that is that first we want to identify priorities, right? And you can there's a bunch of ways to do it in terms of looking back on your season and identifying what you need to work on. But essentially coming up with some priorities which turn into the characteristics that we want to work on. Maybe there's, a list of 5. And so then you just identify, okay, which is the biggest priority that we need to work on. Let's just say it's aerobic threshold work. And so I want to make sure that the exposures in the month or in the cycle, we have the most exposures on that characteristic or on that priority, right? So maybe, threshold work, we're training, 18 times a month. And then, maybe upper body pressing endurance is in there, but, it's second on the list. So we're going to make sure we train that maybe 13 times a month. And so that's essentially how it starts. And then having conversations, for instance, with Nick Sorrell saying, hey, gymnastics, important component. This is a priority that we've identified and that needs to be worked on. And so just making sure that when he comes to the table, he understands the big picture. And I think that that's the key, right? Looping everybody into like the big picture plan, where we are in the season, what the priorities are right now. And it's taken some time, I think, just to, establish a common language. Right. Right. It's hard to throw, 8 people in a room and say, hey, do this. And we've had, now some years where we've all been working together and we've been developing a common language. And I think that that's the biggest speed bump or roadblock that other coaches bump into. And that's honestly our biggest advantage is that we have, a set of full-time coaches that work together all the time. And so if I say, hey, I want a blue color, right? Everybody understands what that blue color is. So if I say blue, you're thinking pink or something else, right? Mm-hmm. So it's about defining what we're talking about. Yeah. Where I think that, it's easy maybe to go find an expert, but it's really hard to find one that understands the way, you work or the way I would work, my style, right? My language, my intent, and then also the sport. So you can start layering things on, which tend to create just a lot of conflict, right? Sure. And so I think that getting everybody together and then allowing the feedback loop to happen, meaning that we're not perfect. We, lay out a plan, everybody contributes, and then we see what happens, right? We see the feedback. from our individual athletes, from our group athletes, and we see what's working and what's not working. And then we can take that back, have conversations, and evolve with it.
So you've worked with so many different teams and you've worked solo as well for years. What is the same? And then what is unique about the way that we're training athletes at Brute?
Yeah. So I think, you say working solo, and I don't know if I ever have worked solo, but I think the biggest difference is that, kind of like I was talking about, is that I never had a consistent team that I worked with for years. And so if I can call up Sorrel, we can pick up exactly where we left off, build upon years and years of what we've been doing. And then what we put out is higher quality. It's more accurate. I think in years past, I've always tried to do that with, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like third-party consultants, right? Like, I have an athlete that's injured, so I'm going to talk to their PT, right? And then they have a hard time understanding what I'm trying to do, even something as simple as like where they are in the season or the demands of the sport. And then the same can be for, nutritionists, or, the classic thing is, people tend to have their training program and then they outsource their specialty programs. That's what I see the most, right? So they maybe get an Olympic weightlifting program or coach on top of what they're doing. And then they maybe get like an endurance athlete or an endurance coach or a swim coach, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just presents challenges. And I think, working solo, it's like you're having to swim upstream, right? And you can never get ahead of what other people are trying to do and trying to understand what they're doing. And now with this team, I talked to Hinshaw on Wednesday, and we're going to talk about some testing protocols and some other things, right? And it's building upon the conversation we had last month,
right?
And so it's fantastic, and it's made me a better coach. Realizing that, I realize I know less about more than ever before now. I also feel like I know more now than ever possible, if that makes sense. So having been exposed and having these conversations makes me realize how little I know
in the grand scheme of things.
Completely.
Right.
Yeah. And it keeps me hungry. And sure, like I know a lot and I'm confident in what I do, but talking to Nick Sorrel about, lever angles and getting into his mind is just mind blowing. And so it's pretty cool. Right. Or talking to, Sean about, strength ratios and how different strength ratios will set up somebody for injury in a unique way. And I don't necessarily need to understand those in detail, but knowing where they exist and kind of the general patterns and just I would say the base knowledge makes me a better coach.
Right. And the person that benefits from this most is the athlete, right? One athlete who has one coach and gets one program has to expend way less energy than an athlete that has their base program and then has to go and synthesize all of these different programs on their own, right? They have to find a separate endurance coach and a separate injury prevention expert and all of these things. They have to expend all of this energy figuring out how does it all work together? They have to basically have a PhD to be able to understand all of these things on their own. So the athlete is the one that benefits the most.
Completely, 100%. And I think that you can see it in, I think there are people out there that have been working with maybe a strength coach and an endurance coach for many, many years and building the rapport and understanding how it all fits together. But what I see more often is folks tend to end up chasing their tail, right? So like, oh, you get a strength coach to get stronger, but then that strength coach over patterns unknowingly, right, with good intent. And it could be the best strength coach in the world, but if that coach doesn't understand the other pieces, right, it may be creating some over patterning. And then the over patterning forces you into looking for a PT because of your knee or your back. And then, that person is like, oh, okay, I need more mobility. So then you go into like yoga and, so it's almost like, one problem or one solution creates a new problem, and it kind of ends up chasing the tail, right? Where, that's where I think the coach comes in for the athlete is that center point, and being able to sort that out. So at the end of the day, if you're an athlete, having a cohesive plan is just going to, one, keep you injury free more so than if it's just a bunch of chaos. Should be able to progress faster, and then help just organize just the other 23 hours in your life, right? Efficiency, right? I think the biggest value, or I don't know if you want to call it commodity, but the biggest thing of value in our current world is time, right? It's one thing that I think everyone's trying to get more of. It's limited, and being able to free your time up as an athlete to focus on being an athlete, to develop that mindset is priceless.
So we're in the off season, and you started to get into your philosophy a little bit, but can you spell out just a little bit more? What is your philosophy in training the off season, and what are the different options for different types of athletes with different training goals?
Yeah, that's a good question. So philosophy, there's a lot of things that encompass my philosophy. I think the characteristics piece is part of it. I think I definitely take a seasonal approach. I take probably more of like a strength and conditioning philosophy to, if you want to say a sport of CrossFit or just training in general. And that's why I think our team is so successful. So I think of the pieces, and I think about dissecting what's going on into the pieces and then addressing and working on those pieces. And I think that's where an individual need really comes in. Like, what do you need to succeed? And there's so many, everyone's different. Maybe there's different goals, right? Timing of the year, age, like there's all these components that kind of maybe adjust the need a little bit, but at a very, very simple level, I look at enduring athletes and powerful athletes. And so you can have athletes that are enduring and need strength and power development, or you have, let's say you are on that power spectrum, that strength spectrum, and you need to develop your engine, right? So I think that's where I start at the very, very foundation of my thought process is kind of breaking things down to the simplest, form. And that's, to me, the simplest form. And I think that there are some things that are important when I think about, characterizing options for folks. So one is, how do you move? I think the quality of movement is becoming more and more important as you get older, as you develop as an athlete, as CrossFit develops. Maybe you play a different sport, but movement quality and movement efficiency is huge, not only for injury prevention, but also just from a performance standpoint. So I look at like how do you move? I look at how is your engine, and then also the strength and power prerequisites, and then I look at the skills. So if you can think about those four categories, the last being skill, which is sport specific. if we want to talk about CrossFit, I think intensity is a sport specific skill, right? Intensity is a skill that can be practiced and honed, things like that. But you could also put in skill there as, weightlifting or gymnastics, even running, right? And so I think those four categories will get you started in the right direction. So what's your biggest need or your biggest limiter? The biggest thing that's in the way of you getting to the next level. So if it's movement, that's where you should start focusing in the off season. If it's, your engine, start building that base, right? Easy way to do it is just 10, 20 minutes in your warm up, just warm up longer. If you do that 5 days a week, that's a lot of time. If it's strength and power, making sure that you're protecting those sessions, nutrition, recovery, all that plays into a part of it. And then obviously, skill, which is, arguably the harder thing to work on, fine tune, just because it is complex. And, if you're talking about Olympic lifting without an Olympic lifting coach in front of you, it starts to become challenging. There are ways around it. I think we do a pretty good job, but in general, I think those four things, if you can identify yourself in one of those areas and you just put more time, more focus into that, it'll start you out pretty well for the off season. For us, I think the endurance, the strength, and the gymnastics groups cover a big part of everybody's needs in some way, if that makes sense. And then obviously when we start working with individuals, we can just get a lot more focused.
Right. What are some of the other really important things to focus on in the off season? And specifically, a good answer to this might be like, what are some ways that people really fuck up their off season?
Yeah, I think being in a rush and realizing that you're a year out and that what you do now directly impacts your potential, right? Not necessarily performance or the outcome, but your potential. And you can, the easiest example is just think about cooking, right? If you skip ahead or don't put an ingredient in, you get something totally different. Right? Just because sugar tastes great doesn't mean you put 10 times more sugar into that cake recipe. So I think just patience is impatience is probably the quickest way to mess that up. And then also
add to that. Add something to that. That's a great example. And I think it really, to take that one step further, I want to tie it back to your original mindset tip, which was to focus on the process. Most people their entire goal is on doing better on the next open, right? But what if we took the approach, I'm gonna commit the next 5 or 10 years to this thing, and I'm going to perfect every part of my game, and it's going to take however long it's going to take. So you might not have your best performance ever in the open this year, but you're going to be cultivating the characteristics and the skills necessary so that at some point you can reach your full potential. But what happens to almost every person is that at some point they rush it because they want to do really well in a competition, and they skip a bunch of steps, right? They stop practicing their technique just so that they can go heavy. They stop practicing their muscle up technique just so that they can do more in the short term, but it takes them longer to do their max potential because they still have less than great technique. So I think taking a really patient approach and saying, I'm committed to this for the foreseeable future, it will help you actually reach what you're fully capable of.
Yeah. And then that brings up a bunch of thoughts for me is like, well, ego, social pressure, community pressure, whether it's social media or, maybe in the gym, the people you train with, right, that creates this external, right, expectations, right? So going back to this idea of intrinsic expectations, it's internal expectations that why are you doing what you're doing, and how can you develop that to where it's unwavering? And I think if the closer you get to that, the more successful long-term athlete development becomes. I think a couple other things that for me, in terms of the off season, is learn to move well, focus on moving well, move and choose with intent. Everything you do should have intent behind it. I think discipline, right? Develop discipline in routine. Fine tune it. Treat it as just as important as your warm up, just as important as your gymnastics skills. Mm-hmm. The attention to detail shouldn't just happen the week before the Open, or you shouldn't get that attention to detail on nutrition 2 months before the Open. It starts now, right? And then honestly, realizing and learning how to train your mind, and all those things I just listed is training. Like, right. I think the biggest thing is people separate. Oh, I go into the gym to train, right? And to get better. Well, you've got, 22, 23 hours in the day outside of the gym that is still training, right? You can still become a better athlete. And honestly, for some folks, for some of you out there, those hours outside of the gym are going to be way more impactful to your performance, to your goals, than that hour, 2 hours in the gym. And it's hard. But that's what's being an athlete is all about. Justin Sua has a quote that I love. I mean, Justin Sua is like, the mindset sensei in my mind. And just, he's awesome.
Yeah. He works with the Red Sox and the Browns, for those of you who don't know Justin.
Yeah. So he has a quote that what he says, one of his quotes, "It's a trap to think you won't experience pain, failure, struggle, or fatigue. Those who don't realize these things are part of the journey tend to resist them. The more you try to avoid difficulty, the more you're going to suffer. Stop resisting adversity and embrace it." And I think that's so powerful in so many ways. The process isn't supposed to be struggle-free. And so as soon as we have that in our mind, how what we're feeling, what we're experiencing isn't supposed to be happening, that's honestly the quickest way that I see that just fractures all of the training, all of that momentum that starts to, really starts in the off season.
Mm-hmm. So we just launched the one-on-one option of Brute, and I want to highlight the reason that it took us this long to offer this. When we first started Brute, this is something that we offered, completely one-on-one training. And we had so many people sign up for our different programs. We didn't have the capacity, the coaching capacity, to do a good job with these athletes. And in fact, I think we did a really shitty job with a handful of them. And so at some point we said, we want to make sure that every person that we're training as high quality and giving them as much attention as humanly possible. So we shut it down for 2 years. Now we have a new capacity. We hired 3 new coaches that you're taking under your wing, and we're offering one-on-one training again. So tell me about the structure of the one-on-ones. You have some interesting things in place, like you oversee all of the programs. You'll have group calls every week to talk about case studies and a number of other things. Talk about it a little bit.
Yeah. When I think about, training an individual and developing a team to support that, a lot goes into it. But one of the things that we've done is, taken the same team, Chris Henshaw, Sean Pastuche, Adrian Conway, Nick Sorrell, yourself, the same core team. And now essentially, the option to have a coach specifically for you to organize all of that information and really design a program that is, specific to your needs is a pretty amazing thing. And one of the things that I'm most excited about is that everyone that we hired on board is, again, the same wavelength, right? They're perpetual students, right? We went through, a ton of folks,
about 100
to find,
or was
I
it
think
more
it was,
than 100?
it's 200.
200 applicants for these coaching positions, and we narrowed it down to 3.
Yeah, completely. And a lot of these coaches that we have, we just known through the years, right? So anyways, and so this idea that no one person can have all the answers or provide everything that an athlete needs in a complex sport is kind of underlining everything. So what we do is, you have your individual coach, your one-on-one coach, that is the kind of center point, the curator, the organizer of the program, everything. And then in the background, which a lot of people don't see, is us getting together a couple times a week and going through case studies and programs and saying, hey, this is what I just had a conversation with Hinshaw. This is the testing protocol I just want put through this athlete, and this is what we're going to do here. And then the awesome thing there is that everyone gets to see that and learn from it. And maybe that coach, there's a light bulb that goes off, or maybe there's a similar athlete, a similar characteristic that they're trying to develop, and then they can, have that conversation with Hinshaw. They can develop the testing protocol. So it's really just everything kind of builds on itself. So these weekly case studies where we're all talking about what's going on. I do oversee, all the programs in a way. There's this big collection of everybody looking at the work that's being done, and then again in the background, the ability to, have Nick Sorrell design something very, very specific for the needs of a one-on-one athlete. So I think it's taken a while to put the pieces in place, but I think it's unique where we have a full-time coaching staff that's committed to one-on-one coaching. So a lot of what's out there, I think, is maybe there's a individual coach out there, and sure, maybe they have developed relationships with PTs and endurance coaches and everything. But I think it's pretty powerful, pretty unique that we have that full-time staff that works together all the time,
and their ability to, again, I'm possibly overusing this word at this point, but synthesize our ability to synthesize all of these things into an effective training program is over and above everyone else, because everyone speaks that common language.
Yeah. And everyone works together. I mean, it's and it's nothing that we're not doing already for, I don't know, Carl Webb, or that we did for the Wasatch Brutes or Christine Ondali, right? For those of you guys who don't know, Christine had a couple years ago, she had essentially two torn labrums coming out of regionals, and working with Sean Pastuche from Active Life and being able to, coordinate that work post-surgery, and taking her from functional to performance to where she, competed in the open, and now she's kind of back with the ability to train. I mean, something like that, man, it's really, really difficult to do if I wasn't talking with Sean all the time.
So guys, you can find out more about this one-on-one offering by going to brutestrengthtraining.com/programs. And any of our competitor programs, the Games Prep, Compete, or Masters, all have options to have a one-on-one coach. So again, that's brutestrengthtraining.com/programs. This is episode 2 of 6. I'll be back next week with Matt Bruce. We're talking about weightlifting. Thanks a lot, Nick. This was great.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Your journey towards better fitness continues. Head over to brutestrengthtraining.com to connect with Michael and his guests. Access links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive to podcast listeners. That's brutestrengthtraining.com.